Today is Friday, May 10th, 2024. You have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here once again with my podcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Wallace Smith, how did your week go?
Oh boy, well, it's only 3:45 or so. Ask me later. That's true. It has been a busy week. So it's been, but has gone good. It has been a productive week. I will say that. It's been
It really has. What's our podcast today?
Well, today we are taking a look, and surely you've noticed you can't escape the news. There's a phenomenon out there involving a lot of young people. We want to talk about it today. We're going to talk about these campus protests in terms of all these individuals coming together wanting to support, well, what they say, free Palestine from the river to the sea and trying to stop the war in Gaza. And we want to look at that, like we always do, from a biblical point of view and kind of keep our heads on. So we're going to talk about these campus protests.
All right. This sounds good. Let's hit it.
Welcome back. And I kind of bumbled that introduction a little bit. We were just chatting about that here during the musical pause. But we want to talk about these campus protests. A lot of people, what are we out here talking to? We're talking to you teens and young adults in the church. And what do you see? A bunch of, frankly, older teens and young adults camping out, protesting, trying to shut down little parts of campuses. They have their various messages. You have police being called. What do we think about these campus protests trying to alter the course of events in Gaza? At least that's the way it seems, what they're trying to achieve here and there. But before we get into all of that, we have a little housekeeping stuff to do. One, this is our 99th episode, Mr. Robinson. I just want to say thank you for being willing to do this with me for, well, once we finish this one, 99 episodes. Yeah. That's a lot.
I've heard people, when they hit mile markers, say, it's been a lot of fun. And that's the way I always find myself wanting to describe it. When you suggested that we do this, and we had some hopes that, our friendship and our chemistry would come out and be good or be entertaining and informative. But at the same time, we didn't know for sure if it would work.
Right.
And I still find myself kind of amazed that we now have done 99. But the way I find that I want to describe it is it's been a whole lot of fun.
I think that's the best way. There's still time for us to flame out. But that said, it has been a lot of fun. I've appreciated it, Ms. Robinson. I do feel we enjoy our conversations, certainly when the microphones aren't on, and you never really know how that's going to translate. And really, part of why we're doing it, a big reason, well, of course, the reason is because of all y'all listening, but also because of the good feedback y'all have been giving us. Mm-hmm. I would say if we have been receiving a bunch of discouraging feedback, discovering this is not helping, please stop what you're saying. You're making our lives worse. We would definitely reconsider. And so we really appreciate that. And we hope to do something special for the 100th episode. I know we've talked to Mr. Weston. He's definitely game for it. But he is also a very busy man, so he might only show up for the 101st or the 102nd. We'll see. So we'll do our best. But that will not happen next week. So that's the second bit of housekeeping I wanted to let you know is we will be taking a break next week. Mr. Robinson is going to have some well-deserved time with his family. It's one thing to talk about being a good husband and then completely neglect your family. Mr. Robinson does not do that, so they're going to be able to do that. The Council of Elders meetings as well going on next week. And we just learned from experience, it's really hard to get something in. I might try if I can. It's funny how, I was going to say dance card. I don't know our young audience, they even know what a dance card is. It used to be for school dances.
I barely know what a dance card is.
For school dances, even before my time, so let's be clear. You'd have like a dance card, and so the goal is to dance with a certain number of people at a school dance or something, and you wanted to fill out a dance card and kind of sign up. But anyway, that's my understanding. If we have any older listeners who know I'm getting it wrong, let us know. But a lot of the council members, they get in and their dance card's kind of already full. They're meeting with Dr. Winnell or Mr. Rod McNair for church administration about something. So it's kind of hard to grab one of these guys. But we really do enjoy, like the one we did with Mr. Peter Nathan and others, we really enjoy giving you an opportunity to know some of the council members better. So if I can, I might try to do that. But regardless, that we still won't have a program next week. We'll be taking a break next week, and then the week after that will be our 100th episode, God willing. So anyway, that's all the housekeeping. Let's get to the topic. And I don't know where you're getting most of your news on these protests, Mr. Robinson. Twitter has become most of my source, and then from there I'll follow links to various news sources, whether it's CNN or something else. I'm not sure where you've been hearing about them.
That's actually one thing I miss about Twitter, and I've been off of Twitter for at least 7 years. But what I did like was it was a good way to keep up with the news. You just follow a handful of news organizations, and the articles flip through there, the news items, and it was a good way to keep up. These days I have to put a little more effort into it. I have a couple of mainstream sites I go to. Definitely one more left-leaning in my opinion, and one, and Fox News is the other one that's often considered right-leaning. We could discuss that. That would actually be interesting. In my opinion, it's not as right-leaning as it seems to be. And then a bunch of independent. There's some good independent journalists out there. That's how I keep up with it. So let me ask you this question then, Mr. Smith.
Okay.
When tackling something like this, and who are these protesters, for example, isn't the first thing we want to do is kind of lump everybody together into one homogenous group?
You're so funny and sarcastic, Mr. Robinson.
Oh, thank you.
No,
it's been a long week.
It has been. We did want to say here at the beginning that we're not trying to lump people into one big group. It is very easy, and both when it comes to politics, and maybe we should have disclaimer guy come and say that we're not being political. In fact, tell you what, before I go on, let me go ahead and have a disclaimer guy. Disclaimer guy, please help us understand. Are we being super political in this podcast? Go.
The Living Church of God does not involve itself in politics. Any resemblance between the comments that follow and getting involved in politics is purely coincidental, or is a figment of your imagination. Control yourself.
Thank you, disclaimer guy. So that said, we do not want to fall into the trap of completely labeling a whole group of people as if they are monoliths and they're all one way. So also you, dear listener, teen and young adult, resist that temptation. The world will try to convince you to do that because it's how they manipulate you into getting behind causes, into starting to feel political, etc. When the fact is, God has created us as complicated creatures. And sometimes you can wander into some of these places and you find some of the more loudmouth people definitely kind of thinking similarly, but you find other people drawn for far different reasons. And we'll actually get into some of those differences a little bit later. But keep that in mind. The very first point I want to make today, we're not trying to lump everybody into one amorphous blob as if they're a monolith and they all think the same way, because they don't. Some are very calculated for why they're there. Some are there for the very reason that supposedly all the protest is going on. Some are innocently naive and just want to do a good thing, and then they get more facts and they realize, what am I doing here? So do keep that in mind.
I remember this will really date me well over 10 years ago, probably more like 13 years ago. I briefly worked with a younger woman who'd come from college, and she was pretty liberal, but we had a good relationship because we had a project we were doing together. And man, such disdain for the Tea Party. We got to get the Tea Party out of here.
Which for those who don't know, because you're all young, was a very conservative organization, kind of grassroots organization.
That's part of that. Well, so when I talked to her a little bit, it became evident to me that she clearly didn't know anything about it.
Oh, interesting.
And you needed to hate the Tea Party. And so one day I said, do you know what the Tea Party is? Yeah, they're like, fascists or something. That's like, okay. Do you know what their problem is? Like what they're against?
What they're
advocating? She did not know. I said, well, first of all, Tea Party, TEA, stands for Taxed Enough Already. We already have too many taxes. That was their main platform. And they were deliberately piggybacking it off of one of the key causes of the American The American Revolutionary War was England had raised the price of tea, the tax on it, just a very little bit, and there was a meltdown in the colonies, and that was part of the whole taxation without representation kind of thing. if you're going to raise the tax, that we ought to at least have a representative there to like say why we don't think we should raise the taxes. Anyway, the point was, I was actually quite amazed at how firmly she was against this party while literally knowing nothing about it.
Right. Oh boy, Ms. Robinson, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but you have given us a transition to our next point. The next point is that many of these protesters are not actually informed about the issue. Like you're saying, this was an intelligent woman, right? You're not trying to insult her intelligence.
Not at
I take
all.
it.
I quite liked her. She was the project we had hired her for. She knew what she was doing and was an asset.
This is back in your printing work?
Yeah, back in my printing days. So it was at least 13, 14 years ago. But I just, for such a relatively intelligent, not relatively, I was going to say, for an intelligent person, relatively rational, how clearly, I don't want to use the word programming because that makes it sound like she has no choice. Yet at the same time, she'd just been told by her college peers that this is what we're against because they're, fill in all the blanks of how terrible these people
Right.
were.
Well, if you heard people were a bunch of fascists and they want to do nothing but, destroy the country, how could you not like that?
Yeah, literally Hitler.
That's right.
That's a phrase for those of you who may not know that was popular for a while. Everything was literally Hitler. It's like it's so evil. It's literally Hitler. It's like
no, it's not. Well, in this case, and they have done various interviews. We're not going to play any of those clips on here, but it has been fun to see that not only are some of these students in these protests not even students at the school, or they're students at some other school that are just have traveled to kind of join in, but they've actually talked with them and asked them, well, so what exactly is it you're wanting to change, or what is the problem? That hey, I don't know. They turn to their friend. Hey, what is it again? It's not really sure. We're just trying to support the students here, And then they actually don't know the details, or what they know is kind of like what this young lady about the Tea Party you're talking about. They simply spit back talking points that they have been fed for years. They've just constantly heard, for instance, that Israel is a colonizer in the area, and there's displaced people, and it needs to go away, which is fascinating because a lot of these people tend to be, well, actually I'm going to get ahead of myself. If I talk to Mr. Robinson, we'd want to try to be careful not to get ahead of ourselves. But in cases, if they actually knew what was going on in the area, it's kind of like you think if they actually knew the situation on the ground, they would not be asking for what they're asking for, especially the history of the region. So many of them will say, oh yeah, well, there was the country of Palestine, and then it was taken at whatever. You look at the history of that region, it is long, it is complex. It's kind of like some saying, well, like in America, we should, in some cities, just give them back to the original inhabitants, say the such and such tribe. Mm-hmm. It's very popular these days in some circles. Before you talk to a crowd, I think Microsoft did this on a video. I remember seeing them. Before they even began their presentation about some bit of software, they made sure, it seemed, if I recall correctly, which I may not, they said, we want to acknowledge that the land of our office building, was built on the land of the such and such. It's like, well, okay, that's great, but then from whom did they take it? And you come into the actual, it's like it kind of frustrates me. There's a picture on Pinterest that comes across, believe it or not, I actually do have a Pinterest account, Mr. Robinson, but there's a picture on Pinterest that it keeps trying to feed me where it's a map of North America before Europe arrived, and it's showing where different tribes were. And it's kind of expressing this faux outrage. Why are we never taught this? As if there were several peaceful nations here in North America that somehow Europeans just showed up and discombobulated. When, if you actually go into the history of those nations, they warred against each other, they took land from each other, they exterminated. There's all of this, the very same drama, the only difference being eventually people came that had better weapons, more skills, at least that being the main difference. When should the tribe to whom land is given back, should they then give it back to their tribes, go back to their tribes? Really, who's the inhabitants here? Well, the Babylonians and the Assyrians and stuff took things from Israel and Judah. Mm-hmm. How far back does this go? Yeah. All they know is the talking points. They tend not to actually, at least many of them don't know the actual history.
And sometimes not even very well.
Right.
The talking points. They don't even know the talking points. the talking points very well.
Well, the biblical verse that we thought of for this that would be, again, we're all about trying to think biblically, but one way in which the Bible informs things like this is the advice given in Proverbs 18 and verse 13, where it says, "He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him." And I want to say, Mr. Robbins, sometimes this can be misused where someone has truly something that isn't worth your time investigating and they want you to take a position on it. And if you say, "No, it doesn't sound really realistic to me," it's like, "Well, it's a folly and a shame for you to conclude that until you've heard all of my evidence." But, some things really have to earn the right for your attention. And that's important. Like if I were to tell you that Mr. Robinson, I've discovered a vast tribe of leprechauns who are living underneath all of the highway overpasses. And I've done my research. They're invisible. However, if you go in with just the right offer of various brands of ketchup, I'm trying to make it as stupid as possible. I hope I'm succeeding.
Yeah.
I'm probably losing listeners as we talk. That and offer and trade with them, they'll appear. Well, you would rightly think what about my hypothesis? Feel free and evaluate it here live.
Well, the first thing I would say is, do you have any evidence of that? Also, based on what I know of the entire world and physics, that sounds deeply implausible.
Oh, there you go. Okay, now I could say, but look, Mr. Robinson, I've done the work. It's taken me years to uncover the existence of these leprechauns. Just by saying that, am I truly removing from you the right to draw a conclusion? Of course not. A claim like that really, you have a right to reject certain things out of hand until it's earned your attention. The fact is, we all have a limited amount of attention. Yep. But in this case,
right.
This verse is saying about taking a strong position on something that really there's good worthwhile questions about, and in this case, there are.
Yeah. So these leprechauns. Are they in the room with us right now?
I'm going to regret bringing that up. So let's pretend I never mentioned anything like that.
Just truly very quickly, I can't even remember who the guy was or what the podcast was. So take this data point for what you want. But the guy had one of the most interesting takes on like opinions. He feels like that for something like this, like what you're talking about, like Hamas and Palestinians and Israel and everything, any kind of broad topic like that most people don't actually have an opinion until somebody asks them what their opinion is, and then they feel obligated to immediately form an opinion, and that they hold on to it with so much gusto that it's like incredible, considering that they probably didn't even have an opinion before you asked them about it.
Wow.
So hopefully that supports your problem.
Oh no, it really does. That's actually fantastic. In this case, this is something frivolous. This isn't just this is a war that is going on that is rooted in centuries old difficulties going long before actually any kind of mid-1900s decision concerning the state of Israel. In fact, please read Mr. Hernandez's fantastic article about this several issues ago in the Tomorrow's World magazine. But this is a huge matter that is complicated in multiple levels, and in which there are people dying, not only currently people dying in Gaza, but also the terrible attacks of October 7th of last year. This is not something to just take a position on without having done your homework.
Yeah.
And the Bible says, don't do that.
I've always had some, I mean, from the time I was about 18 or 19, when I started getting interested in news, and at that time, cable had really made some inroads, and CNN comes on. It's like, I think that's the first like true 24-hour news cycle.
It was a big deal.
It was fascinating. So I've always paid some level of attention to politics and geopolitical things. It's just always been interesting to me. And so my point is, I'm relatively informed. I wouldn't even say well informed, but informed about this ongoing, Arab and Israeli or Palestinian and Israeli stuff that's been going on since 1948. And I listened to a podcast. I haven't finished it. That had Mossab Hassan Youssef on it, and his titles of sorts is son of Hamas. His father literally was the founder of Hamas.
I heard someone else talk about him, and my mother-in-law recently talked about him.
Absolutely fascinating. And I realized, as much as I thought I was informed about kind of all the ins and outs and what's going on, I didn't. And so it's very easy to think you know about something and actually be only maybe a basic level of literate on the topic.
Maybe that's an element we can add to this point, keeping it here at this point, but still say that bring some humility to this situation. That's part of what you see. And here you have these, let's say 19, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds, as if they know exactly what should happen in this circumstance. And it's like, you know what? You're not even entirely sure what classes you should take next semester in some cases. You're still trying to figure out what you want in life and what is even true in life. This is going to sound like it's out of nowhere, but there was a popular duo of guys singing in the 80s, Tears for Fears. You remember Tears for Fears?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Everybody Wants to Rule the
My
World.
sister had their original album, like the record, and when we were in I think I was still in middle school.
Really? Okay. I think I remember them from high school. But yeah, talking about the 80s. And they had a few big hits back in the 80s. And I remember they were one of the few groups of performers at the time that were up front because everybody wants to be serious and taken seriously. And I remember them talking about how they were atheists and how, because people that believe in God, it's just a crutch. And well, okay, here they are. And they were young guys at the time. Now, I heard some interview with them far later. They're still doing work, but they're releasing some kind of new album. Mm-hmm. And here they are now in their, I don't know, their 50s, 40s, whatever it is. Yeah. How long? It's been a long, we're kind of old, Robinson. So it's,
they were older than us.
So probably 60s here. Yeah. And they're reflecting back about how they didn't talk about their atheism, but they said that, oh no, we're a lot more mature now. And we just didn't, there's so many things we didn't know back then. We didn't know. And yet, for all the things that they didn't know, they don't mind using their microphone as an opportunity to influence people and try to preach to all these young people on MTV that, people believe in God, it's just a big crutch, and at their age, they had already concluded the matter of whether God exists or not, and they're ready to preach. And then decades later, they conclude, we really didn't know a lot back then. Okay, so humility, in other words, you want to approach the world, and especially the great conversation that's being had. When I say great, I don't mean good, I mean large. Especially when we're young, we need to express humility in the face of the great questions of the world. And of course, because you know the truth or have access to it, to make sure you lean on the truth in those things and not just the things that are being fed to you, because next thing you know, you truly will be fundamentally misinformed. Okay, so we'll get into things related to that. Some of these will definitely overlap, but the third point that we want to talk about much of these protests is that they're just logically incoherent in many ways. For example, it's crazy to see some of them say that they're doing this to take a stand against genocide. And here they fully believe that Israel is committing genocide. Well, one, it's like they've forgotten or maybe never knew what genocide actually is. You were talking about the saying, that so-and-so's like literally Hitler. Mm-hmm. Well, ignoring the abuse against the word literally, which working in editorial, we can't stand for that, Mr. Robinson. However, also, all that does is water down the horrific crimes of Hitler, is to start applying him to everything. Well, same thing, genocide should be taken very seriously. And there was a particular fellow on TV I won't reference, but I appreciated his observation. He said, if you actually look at Hamas and what they have said they would like to do, Palestine from freedom, from the river to the sea.
They're relatively upfront about their.
They are upfront about a desire to commit genocide. And that's what this observer commented. He said that if you look at Hamas, they would, according to their own stated intentions, commit genocide against the Jews if they could, but they can't. You look at the nation of Israel, and they could commit genocide if they wanted to, and yet they don't. It is a startling contrast, but that's kind of what happens when you're mainly motivated by your emotions, and a lot of this is clearly being motivated by emotions. In fact, I don't think it's a coincidence. Maybe it's just because they're more camera friendly, but I'd love to see a statistic. I'd love to actually see if I'm wrong, because I certainly could be. You can't trust the camera. But I see a lot of females taking the lead in some of these things, and it does have to make me wonder if that's part of it. Yeah, in terms of the campus protests, right? Yeah. Now, part of that could be because they take that ideology that men shouldn't lead and we should yield to women's voices. It could be that. What I do know, especially from those I've heard, is that they're generally, many of them at least, again, we don't want to lump them all together, but many are motivated by their emotion. Like they saw a clip on the news of, and this is terrible, war is horrific. God never intended mankind to have to do anything like this. But they'll see some children just, covered in blood because of a bomb explosion or because of some terrible, action that's happening there in Gaza. And they just feel that's got to stop. That's got to stop. Well, that is horrifying. But at the same time, you've got footage that is not as public because it's actually too horrifying to make it as public, of what started this conflict, the immediate start, which is what happened on October 7th last year. I do know some of our individuals, I think Mr. DeSimone, Mr. Wakefield at the NRB this year, they actually did show some of that footage that was being taken by the terrorist attackers. And it's just, it's mind-numbing. You can't talk. I refuse to say some of the details, here audibly for y'all to have to hear. But the thing is, that's not the picture you saw. You saw this other picture. And so it triggers emotion. Well, you know what? Anyone who's not sad about the destruction of war has an issue. But Mr. Rob McNair, I can't remember where I heard this. Maybe Mr. Robinson, you remember, and I can't recall. But I think it was Mr. Rob McNair who said recently, I'd love your feedback, on the idea that emotion it's not bad. Emotion can help you see something that might be important and can help it to find its way on your radar. But once it finds its way there, you need to think about it logically. You can't just keep using emotion to judge the circumstance. Emotion can point you to something that seems significant, like in this case, a child who's suffering. But you can't just simply act based on the emotion. You have to then, say, okay, this is on my radar. Now I want to think about it more profoundly than this. Does that make sense?
Yes. No, that makes a lot of sense. I don't remember hearing that, so I can't add to
Maybe
where
it was
you might have heard it.
I can't remember either. I'll have to ask him.
I have something I could say that would probably paint me as a misogynist, but so I was listening to a podcast recently, and the individual on it was talking about women and how they're higher in negative emotion. And he says that actually makes them great threat detectors. Like they can pick up on threats very well, but it's a little too extra. And so they get false positives. And said actually that's where husbands who are a little more logically oriented can help evaluate the threat. And it doesn't even mean that you have to solve the problem necessarily, but so to me, when I hear that, and I don't know exactly what Mr. McNair had in mind, it did immediately make me think of, that's why a husband and a wife are a great team. That the wife the mother, the wife, has a tendency to see more threats out there, and is concerned about them, and will often bring them up to her husband. The husband wants to just solve the problem right away, but really what he should do is allow her to kind of cycle through it. And sometimes she realizes on her own that there's not a great threat, or the husband says, yeah, I see how that looks, like whatever, but I think we'll be okay, kind of thing.
Right. No, that's a great observation. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I know I appreciate my wife and her emotions because they will move her to bring something to my attention or to ask me about something. And sometimes I'm not a robot, Mr. Robinson. I actually think I'm pretty, I can be emotional here and there. I can get passionate about things. At the same time, her emotion and her compassion. We talked in our last podcast about these wonderful blessings that God gives women in terms of certain traits. That emotional capacity can really be a part of that. At the same time, I've kind of relied on that to help me sometimes consider something in a way that normally I might dismiss it or something. So so I see a lot out there in terms of people acting purely on their emotion. And emotion can be a great source of passion, but kind of like an animal running wild, you've got to bridle that passion and make sure it's either needs to be there, and if so, then channel it properly instead of just letting it run wild and make your decisions for you.
So, Mr. Smith, let me ask you a question. So some of these protesters that are, or many of them that are going on these campuses and trying to take them over and shut things down so that they can be heard and get on the news and all this kind of thing. Why do they pick this particular thing? So, for example, I thought one thing that was interesting is when it gets to be which month now is Gay Pride Month? Is it April?
Oh man, I don't know. I think it's June.
It's coming up. Okay. So many.
It's hard to say. I feel like we just went through one, but
feels like every month is Pride Month now. But so many Western countries. Australia actually for a long time, in my opinion, kind of led the way in some of the Pride stuff. But
they were definitely more progressive in that direction.
So we've all caught up, and then so what happened? And there was blowback on this last year, by the way. All these companies, big companies, Fortune 500 companies, virtue signaling, and they would do a version of their logo in the Pride colors.
Oh, okay? Yeah, that was a big deal, yeah.
But you know where they don't do that is in the Middle East.
That's right.
And so why isn't there protests about that? Why isn't there protests about Hamas or other organizations there in the Middle East throwing homosexuals off roofs?
Right.
Why?
Mr. Robinson, you're getting so good at making sure we move forward in our podcast and don't linger too long. You're doing very well. Good job, Mr. Robinson. That is correct. These protests, it's a great question. It's interesting how much passion there is about this. When if you actually look, not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world, there is an immense amount of suffering going on in the world. Much of it just clearly unjust. Where situations should change, where, the United States or the United Nations, whatever, could intervene. And yet this has engendered this passion. I did try to list some examples, like what you mentioned. If you look at Gaza and the West Bank, now I did some quick research. I can't verify this is 100% correct. We do some pretty quick research here on the podcast sometimes. But best I can tell from a website that was trying to keep track of the laws concerning, for instance, homosexuality. In the Gaza and West Bank, which are Palestinian-controlled territories, next to Israel, right there. In fact, the conflicts in Gaza, homosexuals would be, if they're convicted of being homosexual, they're imprisoned for 10 years. That's generally a sentence. Versus in Israel itself, man, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, I mean, they're doing pride parades. Yeah. So, and of course, we know what our position is. No, you shouldn't have a pride parade. I think it's an affront to God to have, a pride parade there in Jerusalem. However, again, then why, if you were to take right now, let's say the war stops. Let's say it's right before the war and before October 7th. You just had the Gaza and West Bank and Israel, and then you had Jordan, you had Saudi Arabia, you had various nations there in the Middle East, Lebanon, and you were to ask someone who was a feminist, or for that matter, a homosexual, or someone who believes they're a transgendered person, and ask them, hey, regrettably, for whatever reason, you have to go live in the Middle East today. We're gonna put you on a plane for whatever reason it is, and it's required, whether it's your job, whatever it is. That's part of what's weird is the only place they'd really generally want, I'm not trying to speak for all of them, but I guess I'm trying to make a logical deduction, they'd want to live is Israel. It'd be the one place that they're the freest to actually be a feminist, to be, in that case, a homosexual. And that's part of what's strange is some of the people being supported by these protests, whether it's the Iranians, whether it's the Houthis, all those different ones that they're actually trying to support. Many of those are regimes that would butcher some of these people, that would persecute them. Whether there's the legal persecution and there's the other persecution. The only place in Israel that actually would be, the only place in the Middle East that would really be kind of safe for their ideology and such is Israel. And yet here they are protesting about what Israel is doing. And how many years have gone by and they're not protesting about the rights of homosexuals in Gaza or the rights. And then you look at other things. You look at Boko Haram. Mm-hmm. Boko Haram is still out there literally kidnapping women and young girls by the dozens, just going to an entire location, just grabbing everybody and then forcing them into this essentially female slave lifestyle and sexual slave. You can look at Haiti. We have Haiti deteriorating and becoming a failed state in front of our eyes as the gang warfare is growing. And the United States could intervene. I'm not saying we should. Again, go back to disclaimer guy. We're not trying to be political, but I'm trying to talk about the irrationality of what's going on. That, yeah, the U.S. could say, well, we need to intervene there. We need to make sure there's aid, or we need to deprive aid, whatever it is we need to do. You have Myanmar. We have members in Myanmar that are really, or Burma, depending on what you call it. Different people call it different things, but they're going through this devastating civil war. Some of them having to hide, so as not to come into attention. You have Syria. You have North Korea, which forever has, we'll say forever, but for such a long time has been this state in which its people suffer. Why no protest? Why the passion here? And it'll get into a little bit of the next point, but I would say because this is about Israel. It's not about the people of Gaza fundamentally. It's too often, for too many, Israel, which is the closest thing to a Western civilization-based state in the Middle East, therefore associated with colonizers or Western values and those kinds of things, which I'm not even approving all of those values. And it's a matter of protesting them. Really, it's about them. There are so many tragedies and horrors going on in the world, and yet this incites the passion. We should ask ourselves why. They should ask themselves why, and if they're being even consistent. So the point here being that this protest is clearly oddly selective. Why this cause?
Great question.
Good job, Mr. Robinson, asking the question.
There's lots of things. It's all, like, as you pointed out, many of these protesters are women. Well, how about Sharia law in Saudi Arabia? And many of these, in some of these other countries like that, where women can't drive, certainly can't vote.
I think in some places they started letting them drive under certain restrictions, but that's the part of the point is, we're supposed to be fine with that, versus some of these other places. Yeah, it really is. It's another incoherency, but definitely it's selective protesting. It's not people that are serious about actually the broader causes. It's opportunity, and I would say it's an opportunity to see for some, it's a cause that's popular with people that are popular with you, and therefore, is anyone popular with you protesting a lack of intervention concerning Boko Haram, right? Is anyone who's popular with you busy protesting concerning the civil war in Syria and how Assad might be treating, some of his own people? No. And so you don't really care. Well, then if that's the case, are you really driven by your values? Are you driven by what's popular? That we should be driven by our values, by the things that are right or wrong. And for a lot of these protests, it's clearly not the case. Well, when we get into the next point, I think we'll get into the fact that there are some values involved. And that is this next point. In reality, when you really look at some of these protests in detail and you listen to clips of some of the speeches, it's not the stuff that makes the mainstream news. You got to have your kind of a feed here or there that will actually give some footage from inside. But you'll see that a lot of this, they actually don't focus. They certainly don't focus exclusively, and in some cases, it's not even the main focus on Gaza or the Palestinians at all. Rather, it's in a larger way a protest against Western civilization. It's not so much this conflict. It really is broader. It's anti-capitalism, anti-quote-unquote imperialism, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you, maybe you could go into a little bit more detail on, so as you already pointed out, many of these provocateurs don't really know what they're out there truly protesting against. But for those who do know, and maybe, not only instigating it, but maybe even, providing resources so these protests can occur, what is it that they hate about the West and Western civilization?
Well,
is that a different podcast?
No. Well, actually, it would probably not be a bad podcast sometime. But no, I think it's definitely worth touching on here in this particular point. And that is among the things. It's interesting. There's the things they're told that aren't necessarily true. There's things like, Christopher Columbus was a monster. He just came to rape and pillage or something. And I hope we can actually perhaps do an article in the Tomorrow's World magazine for the September-October issue, since that's around Columbus Day, highlighting that actually no, he was he was actually pretty remarkable, and he was pretty decent to a lot of them. They actually tried to improve their lives in a lot of ways against others, even their own, who were abusing them. But so part of it's just the stories they're told about the West by a lot of those who just want to completely reshape Western civilization in their own image. But a lot of it's kind of taught. Actually, for instance, I did find a fellow. I'm not agreeing with everything he always writes, but I thought his article in the Washington Post, I believe, maybe it's just with me that I named the wrong magazine or newspaper when I say things, but I was pretty sure it was the Washington Post, that he wrote of a particular manifesto that some of this, because that's part of what you do as a revolutionary, is you write a manifesto, right? So they wrote. By the way, props for the word provocateur.
Thank you.
Good, nice word there. So Max Boot wrote here again, I believe for the Washington Post. He wrote about from the Student Manifesto, and how the reason they were protesting was for the sake of, quote, creating a multi-generational, intersectional. Even the word intersectional needs explanation. Essentially, it's where multiple different aggrieved groups kind of lump together to seek redress over their imagined oppressors. Yeah. Would you say that? Is that the way to put that?
Yeah.
But they
as soon as you use, where is it? Intersectional, it's getting interesting.
That's right. So creating a multi-generational, intersectional, and accessible space dedicated to fighting for abolition, transnational feminism, anti-capitalism, and decolonization.
Wow.
Well, one, what a bunch of nonsense. And then secondly, what does that fundamentally have to do with what's going? In fact, you look at some others, and they're saying, you know what? This is our opportunity to fight against climate change, of all things. They try to fold this into climate change, of all things.
Well, we can do another podcast on that. What transnational feminism? I've never even heard that phrase before. And how come they're not fighting against transnational feminism starting in the Middle East?
No, it's right. Why is this all of a sudden the fight against transnational feminism? Absolutely. Even the word abolition is funny. That can mean, what does that actually mean? Well, it can be the abolition of slavery. That can be good. But often having a wife in her role as a wife is taught by some as slavery.
The act of abolishing a system.
And it could even be where some I've seen the word used, like when I was doing my research for the Tomorrow's World article about borders, about the vision of a borderless world and the chaos of that abolition of that borders are inherently enslaving, and that all borders need to be removed, right? So who knows? A lot of that is really just talking points. But one thing I like about, again, whether we agree with Max Boot in general, is a few things. One, he calls it revolutionary cosplay. This is not people who want to feel like they're revolutionaries, when what they are not revolutionaries sacrificing themselves for a greater cause. For the most part, they're a bunch of kids who generally have access to a ton of resources, aren't being forced to work for a living yet, who are using their available time to do in this country what they could never do in any other country at a price they could not do in another country. And then wear a what do they call the scarf? A lot of them are wearing.
Oh,
yeah. I know what that is. I have that. I want to make sure I got it right. It's a keffiyeh. Keffiyeh. It's a keffiyeh, right? It's cosplay. It's essentially like going to a comic book convention dressed as Iron Man, and I know he's being abusive, and he actually seems somewhat sympathetic, which I think is actually a fascinating thing. He highlights, this is the last thing I'll mention about this article. He highlights that if you look at studies that were done during the Vietnam War, and back then the protest, that was quite a time of protest. Go back to the Vietnam War, the studies highlight that all those protests generally always did worse for the cause. According to some studies, in fact, did I link to that study? Oh, I didn't. According to some studies, the Vietnam War lasted longer because of the protest, because it so turned the average American's feelings about the war it focused them on the war protesters who were irritating and didn't seem to care about regular people.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on whether or not they thought the war itself was a good or an evil, they were so irritated by the protesters and their actions and their lawlessness and the values that were attached to some of their protesting that they actually started to feel more sympathy for the war effort, and that Nixon probably got actually at least another few years in the war effort because of the protesters. And Max Boot highlights that's essentially what these protesters are doing. You're going to have people that are actually more supportive of the war because of the protesters trying to feel good about themselves, that they're making a big quote-unquote difference, than people who are against the war.
Wow. So what would you say to our youth? Should they find a cause,
No,
dress
I would
up
not say that.
appropriately, go down to a university or a state capitol and protest?
Well, I would say if they're going to find a cause being preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God and dress up appropriately to come to church or go to a TWP, absolutely. But no, they shouldn't. I can't help but read this one title for the New York Times before we get to that point. The New York Times, because the Max Boot article, I'm almost certain was the Washington Post. I'll issue a correction on livingyouth.org if I'm wrong. But the New York Times had an article similar where their title for their article was, "It's Not Just Gaza. Student Protesters See Links to a Global Struggle." And the subhead says, in many students' eyes, the war in Gaza is linked to other issues, such as policing, mistreatment of indigenous people, racism, and the impact of climate change. And the New York Times actually said that they actually kind of talk about like it's a bit of a positive, when it's like, no, this is not. This is a weird hijacking. So I would advise our listeners to consider, guess what, Mr. Robinson, the Bible. There's a great tale of similar things in Acts chapter 19. And the idea of getting swept up in some social cause, that we've got to jump in, we've got to participate.
Which, by the way, is kind of understandable.
Oh yeah, the feeling that injustice is being done and feeling bothered by that, and we can talk about what to do with those feelings. And wanting to do something about it. We can talk about what to do about that feeling. But in terms of joining a crowd to protest and try to use the, if you will, the tools of this world to change these things on this kind of scale, well, one, it's not what God called us to. But even beyond that, even if you think, well, okay, God, still, I think this is really worth it. It is amazing how many of these things are matters of manipulation. Like these young people, money's coming in from somewhere. And Iran is thrilled, right? Well, Iran, some of these protesters would not last a day in Iran.
So Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of Hamas, that was one of the most interesting things he brought in was, because I kind of wonder how much Iran really is. And he's like, no, Iran is in this up to their neck. That they just want to cause as much of an irritant to Israel as possible, which is also being an irritant to the U.S. So that is a big. They do absolutely fund it.
There you go. So here, if you have funding coming in for these protests, and some of the funds, perhaps hypothetically, are coming from people that actually you'd normally be protesting them and their treatment of their people and what they say about rights there, then you're being used. Mr. Weston would make the same point to try to make it to teens, that while you think you're following this particular fashion because it's just you and it's young and it fits your values, when really it wasn't decided by people your age, it's decided by some 70-year-old CEO and his board trying to figure out how to get more money out of teenagers. This is very similar. The people that love these kind of protests, people in other countries who love these kind of protests, are actually some of the people that are like in organizations and governments that are the worst versions of everything these students would actually be against if they knew.
They understood,
That's an irony. So the example in the Bible that I'm thinking of happened in Ephesus during the ministry and during some of Paul's preaching. And we read about it in Acts chapter 19. In Acts chapter 19, starting in verse 23, speaking of what's going on in Ephesus, we read here, Acts 19, verse 23, "And about that time there arose a great commotion about the way." And here it's talking about Christianity, the way that we live. In verse 24, it says, "For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Diana," who was the goddess, if you will, that it was focused on in Ephesus, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. So him making these idols is a great source of profit. They were making a lot of money on these idols. So verse 25, he called them together, that is this silversmith. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, "Men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands." And we did see Paul talking about that there in Athens. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now notice what his first concern is. We are going to be losing a lot of money. If this gets out, we're going to be losing a lot of money. Oh, but by the way, also, this. Well, you continue the story, verse 26. Now, when they heard this about how Diana, the temple, might be despised, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater with one accord. And that's a fascinating contradiction that we'll have explained in a moment. Having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. Notice the contradiction in the first sentence. Well, the first part of the sentence. It says, the whole city was filled with confusion, and yet they rushed into the theater with one accord. So they're rushing with one purpose, which if you look on the outside, you think, oh, there's organization, there's order, there's a people united in spirit. And yet he says, but really it wasn't. Actually, there was profound confusion. And you see that explained in more detail in verse 32. It says in verse 32, "Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and most of them did not know why they had come together." All of these people were being manipulated by this small group of people that they want to make sure they sell lots of great idols, and and they're being manipulated. They're sincere passions, right? They're sincere passions, but they're being manipulated. The fact is, that is so often the way of the world. And Ms. Robinson, to answer your question, no, God does not want us putting on a keffiyeh or putting on any particular thing, going out and joining these worldly causes and trying to fix the world in a worldly fashion. Mm-hmm. What does he call us to do? He calls us to be a part of God's work. He calls us to actually be a part of preaching the only actual solution to these things, which is the return of Jesus Christ. And he expects us to be a source of that information, not bolstering them that you're right, we need political change there. No, we actually need Jesus Christ, and that's what we're called to exemplify.
Let me see if I understand correctly, because what I've primarily gotten out of this section of Scripture is that Ephesus was an ancient tourist trap. All things, I actually appreciate how, first of all, what a fantastic section of Scripture that is.
Isn't it, though?
I mean, no, it really is quite nice.
You say what you did when my wife and I went to go around the Vatican, when we had the opportunity to be in Rome, and we went by the Vatican. It was amazing how many Pope and Mary themed cigarette, what do you call it? The dish cigarette. You put your cigarettes out, or
ashtray.
Ashtray. I couldn't think of it. All these chintzy things that were totally like, yes. Oh, here's the Pope on an ashtray. Here's the Virgin Mary, quote unquote, on an ashtray. Very much a lot of money to be made. So.
But in all seriousness, I like how you've kind of brought this back around to what is the true answer? Like what should a younger listener's conduct be going forward? Well, if you want to change the world, and then that's a lot
and
of
we
these,
should want to, and
we should want to change the world. A lot of these well-intentioned people want to change the world. They just don't know how. Two, they're kind of naive, many of them, and so they're being kind of co-opted by another group and off trying to change the world, protesting something that they don't even know what they're really truly protesting. And so, if I may, changing the world is exactly what the church's message is. We are not personally trying to change the world in that sense. Like, we're not out there being active and trying to change this current present world, right. But we are trying to get people to to hear the message and change their lives, and which is the only thing that truly makes an improvement is for somebody to be called by God and to make changes in their lives, and their life improves and the life of those around them improves. And so if you want to protest something, protest sin. Put on your provocateur outfit, which is a suit and a pretty dress, and come down to church services and learn what the church is doing and get involved and get behind it. I'm not one to be. I've been dinged in the past, appropriately so, for not having much of a call to action. But man, if you want to change the world, get involved in what the church is doing.
You know, we're not Pentecostal types, but I'll say amen to that, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Smith.
You're welcome. Because, for instance, if someone were talking to me, and I that's one thing, that's why we started off the way we did. We don't want to dismiss people that are moved by compassion. When you see children that have had the terrible tragedy to have to be near a bomb blast, it is heartbreaking. And your emotion just says, this has to stop, right? This can't go on. Well, that's fine, but to turn that into some kind of policy position and try to, so based on the system of the world, what needs to be done? Well, they want to say is the war has to stop. At the same time, then you're ignoring why the war is going on in the first place, because what at least, conclusions are that, well, if the pressure stops the war, that teaches the leaders over there, in this case Hamas, who does not, frankly, in a lot of ways have illustrated a lack of concern for their people. And it's like, oh, good, with enough pressure from all the other nations of the world, all this will stop. We'll stay in power. And the next time we have an opportunity to do another October 7th, we're going to do that.
Right.
That is,
right.
The feeling that this must stop, the heartbreaking response to seeing a child, or not just a child, of course, anybody, but I didn't highlight on that, who's been hurt in one of these things, that is a right response. But we have to turn that emotion in the direction that Christ would turn it to. The way he felt, he wanted to stop what was coming to Jerusalem. He told those in Jerusalem, how I've longed to just cover you like a hen covers her baby chicks, with its wing, but you would not have it to be so. You wouldn't allow that to happen. What the world actually needs is a change of human nature. And if someone wants to engage you on something like this, like, well, what do you think they ought to do? I don't want to discourage you from engaging unless you just don't feel ready. But that is an opportunity to say, and help them to see, do you see how there's actually no real human solution to any of this? There's not, we stop the war here. What prevents that from simply emboldening those that Israel is trying to stop from coming across their borders and something? Well, they ought to do this. They ought to, well, again, that part of that brings in research. They ought to just agree to a two-state solution. It's like, well, the most fierce opponents to a two-state solution were the very people that the Palestinian leadership, that didn't want to agree that Israel has a right to exist. You go into all of this stuff.
This is a great chance to ding democracy as well, because they've tried the two-state solution, and there's been a two-state solution in place really for 20 years, maybe.
Oh yeah,
more?
Essentially, you're right.
So what happens when there's democracy in certain areas? Well, they vote in Hamas.
Yeah, the very people that they elected in Gaza were the very leadership that decided to send men, in waves to go and rape and to murder and to butcher children and women and men. So yeah, the world's tools, they're just simply not sufficient, and there's nothing wrong. It's not a cop-out to be the source of the message that says, what the world actually needs is the rulership of Jesus Christ. That is the message of the gospel, and it's not a cop-out. It's literally the very message that the church exists to preach in the world. And I'm so grateful, Mr. Robinson. When I look back, I'm grateful to you. I need to be explicit because I do feel, when looking at my comments over the last almost an hour at this point, that I was at risk of sounding like I'm trying to say don't care about these things,
right,
and that's not. And so thank you for saying that, Mr. Robinson, because no, you should be moved by the images
definitely.
that you see. They should matter to you. It's just a matter of what you do with them.
Well, so that, of course, reminded me of a very ancient warning that I do think about from time to time, truly, because, so for example, I've mentioned this before. Why did Lot's wife turn into a pillar of salt? There's some indication that she looked back with regret that God was destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And we should definitely not feel that way. We either shouldn't become so desensitized we think it's not that bad, or become in some way callous in our heart about things. And in Ezekiel 9, if you want to go read the whole, I'd recommend the whole chapter. But God judges Jerusalem and the people there, and so there's a story of the glory of the God is. In fact, let me just read it. That'd be better. Ezekiel 9:3-4. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. So it's like starting right at the temple. And he called to the man clothed with linen, who had the writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. God wants us to see and evaluate, wow, this is really wicked and evil, and there's so much suffering, and people are doing terrible things, and that should prick our conscience, and that should bother us. We should truly, deeply lament what's going on around us and want it to be fixed. And I understand that and some people succumb to this, the drive, the desire to go get involved in a cause and try to fix it now. But man, we cannot fix it now. So I think about the United States recently, and I think, well, if I wanted to get America back to whatever condition I wanted it in, like where would I start, and what would I have to rehabilitate? Increasingly, it's like everything: education systems, government systems, state governments, local governments. I won't say what show I'm watching, but it's somebody you wouldn't expect gets into farming. They have all this farmland. And the guy who used to farm the land left, and now he's farming. And one of the first things he starts to get really frustrated with, of all the things he get frustrated with, is dealing with the local community and the regulations that are put in place. He's like, why do I have to do this and that and the other? I've gone astray here from our excellent lessons, but don't. We're not telling you not to be bothered by things or not care. Yeah, that's really the best way of summarizing it. Please do care, and God will take note of the people that do care.
He will. In fact, Jesus Christ is going to build his reigning kingdom and those who rule in that out of people who care. But people who weren't willing to compromise and try to fix those things with the ways of the world, but people who struggled in their hearts, patiently provided a witness to his role as the only true Savior in these things, and look forward all the more in their grief about the world today towards his return, bringing the only solution mankind can ever actually hope to experience.
Smith and Robinson.